By the age of 24, Andre Agassi had already won Grand Slams, earned millions, and reached world number one. From the outside, his life looked untouchable. But behind the trophies, Agassi was spiraling into depression and drug use, trapped in a career he never chose. In just a few years, he collapsed from the top of the world to outside the top 100. This wasn't a fall caused by injury or bad luck. It was the slow destruction of a child forced to become a champion. By 1997, the collapse was no longer invisible. Andre Agassi wasn't just losing matches. He was losing control. His ranking kept falling. His body felt heavier. His mind felt empty. The crowd that once cheered now watched him with confusion, then silence. Behind closed doors, Agassi was spiraling. Cocaine entered his life not as rebellion, but as escape. A way to quiet the noise. A way to numb the hatred he carried toward the sport that had defined him since childhood. Each match became harder to face. Each win felt meaningless. Each loss felt deserved. At his lowest point, Agassi had fallen from world number one to outside the top 100. For a player once marketed as the future of tennis, it was humiliation on a global scale. Sponsors faded. Headlines changed tone. The image of the confident rebel cracked, revealing exhaustion and shame underneath. What made this collapse more dangerous was how alone it was. There was no dramatic injury. No public breakdown. Just a slow erosion of purpose. A man still young, still famous, still wealthy, but quietly self-destructing. Every time Agassi stepped onto the court, he carried two battles. One against the opponent across the net. And one against the voice inside him whispering that none of this was ever his choice. The world saw a fallen champion. But the real story was deeper. This wasn't about losing tennis matches. It was about losing himself. Andre Agassi was born in 1970 in Las Vegas, a city built on lights, noise, and illusion. But his childhood had little to do with freedom or choice. Inside his home, life followed a single rule. Tennis came first. Everything else came later. His father, an immigrant from Iran, believed greatness was something you could force into existence. He wasn't chasing joy or balance. He was chasing certainty. From the moment Andre could hold a racket, his future was decided for him. Not discussed. Not negotiated. Decided. There was a tennis court behind the house. And there was a ball machine. Thousands of balls. Fired at a small child again and again. Miss one, and the pressure increased. Slow down, and the session lasted longer. This wasn't training as play. It was conditioning. Repetition without tenderness. Discipline without warmth. By the time Andre was 5 or 6 years old, tennis was no longer a sport. It was a threat. A test he could never fail. He didn't dream about winning. He worried about disappointing. He learned early that love came with conditions. That approval arrived only after obedience. There were no afternoons wasted with friends. No room to be bored. No chance to explore what he liked or who he was. His identity narrowed around one thing. Hit the ball. Hit it harder. Hit it again. Childhood slowly disappeared, replaced by expectation and fear. As Andre grew older, the pressure didn't ease. It intensified. His father believed weakness was dangerous. Doubt was unacceptable. Pain was something you ignored. Emotions were obstacles. If Andre struggled, the solution wasn't rest or understanding. It was more work. More hours. More balls. What this created wasn't resilience. It created anxiety. A constant, quiet tension. Andre learned how to perform under pressure, but not how to feel safe. He learned how to win, but not how to choose. Tennis became the language through which control was enforced. And slowly, resentment took root. By his early teens, Andre was already exceptional. Coaches noticed. Scouts talked. The path to professional tennis opened quickly. To the outside world, this looked like a gift. To Andre, it felt like a trap closing. The better he became, the harder it was to escape. He didn't hate tennis because it was hard. He hated it because it was never his. It had taken his childhood, shaped his relationships, and defined his worth before he understood what worth even meant. Every victory felt hollow. Every loss felt dangerous. When Andre left school early to pursue tennis full-time, the choice wasn't framed as a decision. It was presented as destiny. By then, there was no alternative identity waiting for him. No version of life without tennis. Only the continuation of a role he had been playing since he was a child. This is where the foundation was set. Not for success alone, but for collapse. A life built on control produces achievement quickly. But it leaves cracks beneath the surface. Cracks that grow wider when fame arrives. Cracks that deepen when the applause fades. Years later, when Andre would spiral into depression and self-destruction, the world would search for explanations in money, fame, or pressure. But the real story began much earlier. On a quiet court behind a house in Las Vegas. With a child hitting balls, not because he wanted to win, but because he was afraid to stop. By the mid-1980s, Andre Agassi stepped into professional tennis while most teenagers were still trying to understand who they were. He didn't arrive slowly. He arrived fully formed, powerful, fearless on the surface. The tour saw a young player with explosive ground strokes and an attitude that refused to blend in. From the beginning, Agassi felt different. Not just in how he played, but in how he was marketed. Tennis had always preferred quiet discipline and polished manners. Agassi showed up with long hair, loud clothes, and a defiant presence. Sponsors loved it. Broadcasters loved it. The sport suddenly had a new face for a new era. Money came fast. Fame came faster. Before his 20s, Agassi was already earning more than most players would in an entire career. To the outside world, this looked like a dream unfolding exactly as planned. A prodigy fulfilling his destiny. But inside, nothing felt stable. Every tournament felt like a performance he couldn't escape. Winning didn't bring relief. It only raised expectations. Losing felt dangerous, like confirmation of every fear he had carried since childhood. Tennis wasn't something he chose each morning. It was something waiting for him, demanding obedience. As his ranking climbed, the gap between image and reality widened. Interviews painted him as confident, rebellious, carefree. Privately, Agassi felt trapped. He didn't know how to slow down. He didn't know how to stop. His entire identity had been built around results. Without tennis, there was nothing underneath. The early losses hit harder than they should have. Not because of pride, but because of fear. Fear of disappointing. Fear of being exposed. Fear that without winning, he had no value. The same patterns from childhood followed him onto the professional tour. Only now, the audience was global. Agassi began to clash with coaches. Structure felt suffocating. Guidance felt like control. He pushed people away, not out of arrogance, but out of exhaustion. Every authority figure reminded him of the life he never chose. Independence became his defense mechanism, even when it worked against him. Despite the chaos, results kept coming. Finals. Titles. Headlines. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Agassi was no longer just a rising star. He was a central figure in the sport. The pressure intensified. So did the confusion. What made this stage especially dangerous was how success masked the damage. As long as Agassi kept winning, no one asked hard questions. No one noticed how hollow victories felt to him. No one saw how disconnected he was from the person he was becoming. Each season moved faster than the last. There was no pause to reflect. No space to ask whether this life made sense. The machine kept moving, and Agassi stayed inside it because he didn't know how to step out. This phase of his career wasn't about failure yet. It was about momentum without direction. About a young man achieving everything he was told to want, while quietly losing touch with why he was still playing. The stage was set. Fame was secured. Expectations were locked in. And beneath the surface, the tension continued to build. Because when success arrives before self-understanding, it doesn't bring peace. It only delays the collapse. By the early 1990s, Andre Agassi was no longer just a star. He was the symbol of a new era. Tennis had found its rebel, its commercial magnet, its bridge to a younger audience. Stadiums filled faster when his name appeared on the draw. Television ratings climbed. Sponsors lined up. His game backed up the image. Power from the baseline. Fearless returns. A presence that made opponents uncomfortable before the first point was played. Agassi didn't look like tradition. He looked like change. And the sport rewarded him for it. The breakthrough moments came one after another. Deep runs at major tournaments. Finals that confirmed he belonged among the elite. Then Grand Slam victories that removed any remaining doubt. By the mid-1990s, Agassi reached what every professional player is taught to chase from childhood. He became world #1. From the outside, this was the destination. The proof that everything had been worth it. The years of pressure. The sacrifices. The intensity. To fans and media, Agassi's story looked complete. A prodigy fulfilling his promise. A champion living the dream. But internally, the moment felt strangely empty. Becoming #1 didn't quiet the noise in his head. It amplified it. Every match now carried the weight of expectation. Every loss felt like betrayal. Every win felt temporary. Success stopped being something to celebrate and became something to defend. The media built an image that left no room for weakness. Agassi was framed as confident, fearless, untouchable. Interviews focused on his swagger, his fashion, his rivalry with other stars. The narrative was simple and flattering. This was a man who loved the spotlight. A man born for the stage. The truth was more complicated. The spotlight felt harsh, not warm. Fame didn't bring freedom. It narrowed his world. Schedules tightened. Obligations multiplied. Privacy disappeared. The more visible he became, the less space he had to understand himself. Agassi began to feel trapped by his own success. He couldn't step away without disappointing millions. He couldn't admit confusion without risking his image. The higher he climbed, the harder it became to tell the truth. The public version of Andre Agassi no longer matched the private one. Winning Grand Slams didn't heal old wounds. It reopened them. Each trophy reminded him how long he had been living someone else's plan. Each celebration felt performative. Cameras captured smiles. Inside, he felt distant, detached, sometimes numb. At the height of his fame, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. He had achieved everything the sport promised. Money. Recognition. Status. Yet the feeling he carried most often wasn't pride. It was exhaustion. The kind that doesn't come from training too hard, but from pretending for too long. Relationships suffered. Trust was difficult. Vulnerability felt dangerous. Agassi had learned early that showing weakness led to punishment or control. Now, even among friends, he struggled to be honest. The world knew his ranking. It didn't know his fear. The tour moved fast. Seasons blended together. There was little time to reflect on what he wanted beyond winning the next match. Tennis dictated his calendar, his value, his identity. Without it, he didn't know who he was supposed to be. This period of dominance looked like stability. In reality, it was pressure sealed tight. The cracks were already there. Loss of motivation. Emotional distance. A growing sense of resentment toward the game itself. Agassi didn't collapse at the bottom. He began to fracture at the top. The most dangerous moment in any career is not failure. It's success without meaning. When applause becomes background noise. When achievement stops feeling earned and starts feeling imposed. By the time the world fully embraced Andre Agassi as a champion, the internal countdown had already started. The body was still competing. The ranking still reflected greatness. But the connection between the man and the game was weakening. The fall, when it came, would shock everyone. Not because it was sudden, but because no one had been listening. The cracks didn't appear overnight. They widened quietly. Match after match, season after season, the pressure kept building while Agassi kept pretending it wasn't there. On court, the intensity remained. Off court, something was slipping away. Motivation faded. Joy disappeared. The game that had once demanded everything now gave nothing back. Losses began to feel heavier than before. Not because of ranking points, but because each defeat echoed a deeper belief he had carried since childhood. That without winning, he was nothing. Training felt pointless. Matches felt exhausting before they even started. The rituals of professional tennis became mechanical, empty repetitions without meaning. As his performance declined, the inner dialogue turned darker. Self-doubt wasn't new, but now it was constant. He questioned his talent. He questioned his purpose. He questioned whether he belonged at all. The confidence the world saw was no longer real. It was a shell designed to survive interviews and expectations. Isolation followed naturally. Agassi pulled away from coaches, friends, anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions. Vulnerability felt dangerous. Admitting struggle felt like failure. He had been trained his entire life to hide weakness, not understand it. So he did what he knew. He hid. The tour can be lonely even for stable athletes. For someone already disconnected from himself, it became unbearable. Hotels blurred together. Airports felt endless. Nights stretched longer. Sleep became unreliable. Thoughts raced when the noise stopped. Eventually, escape presented itself. Not as rebellion. Not as excess. But as relief. Cocaine didn't enter Agassi's life to make him feel powerful. It entered to make him feel quiet. For brief moments, the noise softened. The resentment dulled. The pressure loosened its grip. But relief came with a price. Focus disappeared. Recovery slowed. Discipline eroded. The very thing he had relied on for survival began to unravel. His ranking dropped. Matches slipped away. Confidence collapsed in real time, visible to everyone watching. The fall was humiliating because it was public. Tennis doesn't hide decline. Every loss is recorded. Every ranking update is published. Agassi went from being the future of the sport to a cautionary tale. From world number 1 to outside the top 100. Headlines changed tone. Praise turned into speculation. Commentators questioned his commitment. Fans wondered if the rebel image had finally caught up with him. Few understood what was really happening. This wasn't arrogance. It was exhaustion. It wasn't laziness. It was burnout at a level most people never see. What made this period especially dangerous was how normal it looked from the outside. There was no dramatic collapse. No public confession. No visible breakdown. Agassi kept showing up. Kept playing. Kept losing. Quietly. Inside, shame grew heavier than pressure. He felt exposed. Weak. Fraudulent. The sport that had defined him now felt hostile. Every match reminded him of the life he never chose. Every camera felt intrusive. Every question felt like accusation. The more his career slipped, the more he blamed himself. Not just for losing, but for feeling the way he did. He had everything people dream about. Fame. Money. Opportunity. That made his unhappiness feel unjustifiable. So he buried it deeper. This wasn't the bottom yet. But it was the descent. The slow, dangerous phase where self-destruction feels manageable. Where denial still works. Where consequences haven't fully arrived. Agassi was still young. Still talented. Still visible. But the foundation was collapsing. And the hardest part was this. He didn't know how to stop. The moment of exposure didn't come with a scandal on television. It came quietly, and that made it worse. Agassi failed a drug test. Cocaine was found in his system. For a player already collapsing, this should have been the end. The career-ending headline everyone expected. Instead, something darker happened. Agassi wrote a letter. Not a confession. A story. He blamed the result on accidental ingestion, claimed ignorance, and watched as the explanation was accepted. The suspension never came. The public never knew. On paper, he was spared. Inside, the damage deepened. Avoiding consequences didn't bring relief. It brought shame. A heavier kind. The kind that tells you your survival came at the cost of honesty. Every time he stepped onto the court afterward, he carried the weight of that lie. Winning felt undeserved. Losing felt inevitable. This was the most dangerous phase. Not when he was punished, but when he wasn't. The absence of accountability allowed the spiral to continue. The voice inside him grew louder. You're fake. You don't belong here. This isn't your life anyway. Physically, his body reflected the collapse. Conditioning slipped. Injuries lingered longer. Recovery slowed. The discipline that had once been forced into him now felt unreachable. Tennis demanded precision and commitment. Agassi brought doubt and fatigue. Matches became psychological battles he kept losing before the first serve. Confidence vanished. Not dramatically, but steadily. He stopped trusting his instincts. He stopped trusting himself. Each defeat reinforced the belief that the fall was permanent. The loneliness intensified. Fame didn't protect him. It isolated him further. People expected confidence, strength, gratitude. No one expected confusion. No one wanted to hear that success had become suffocating. So he said nothing. Depression doesn't always look like sadness. Sometimes it looks like apathy. Sometimes it looks like indifference toward your own future. Agassi continued playing not because he wanted to, but because stopping felt impossible. Tennis had been his entire structure since childhood. Without it, there was nothing to fall back on. He began to question everything. Not just the sport, but his worth as a person. If tennis was gone, who was he? There was no answer. Only fear. Public perception hardened. Commentators labeled him inconsistent, undisciplined, overrated. The rebel image lost its appeal. Sponsors hesitated. Invitations faded. The tennis world moved on quickly, as it always does. What hurt most wasn't the criticism. It was the realization that he agreed with it. He felt like a disappointment. To his family. To the sport. To himself. There were moments when walking away felt tempting. Not as a dramatic exit. Just disappearing. Letting the ranking drop. Letting relevance fade. Ending the performance. But even that required a choice he didn't yet know how to make. This was the breaking point. Not a single match. Not a single headline. But a slow accumulation of consequences finally reaching critical mass. The lies. The avoidance. The resentment. The fear. They all converged. Agassi had reached the end of the road built for him by others. Continuing meant losing himself completely. Stopping meant facing everything he had avoided since childhood. For the first time in his life, there was no authority figure left to dictate the next step. No crowd to impress. No image to protect. Just a man alone with a question he had never been allowed to ask. Do I keep running from this life? Or do I finally choose it, or leave it, on my own terms? That question marked the end of the collapse. And the beginning of something far more difficult. Change didn't arrive as motivation. It arrived as exhaustion. Agassi didn't wake up one day inspired. He woke up unable to continue the same way. The lies were heavy. The resentment was constant. The fear of facing himself had finally become weaker than the fear of staying the same. For the first time, he stopped running. Not dramatically. Quietly. He admitted what had been avoided for years. He was unhappy. He was lost. He was playing a sport he had never chosen. Saying it didn't fix anything immediately, but it broke the pattern of denial that had kept him trapped. Cocaine had numbed the noise. Removing it brought the noise back louder than ever. Anxiety. Shame. Regret. Memories from childhood resurfaced. The ball machine. The endless drills. The conditional approval. Recovery wasn't heroic. It was uncomfortable and slow. There were no shortcuts this time. Agassi began rebuilding from fundamentals. Not technique. Identity. He questioned why he was still playing tennis at all. The answer wasn't simple. He didn't suddenly love the game. But he realized something important. Walking away wouldn't heal the damage either. He needed to choose tennis consciously, not as a prison, but as a tool. That shift changed everything. Training became intentional instead of compulsive. He stopped chasing image. Stopped trying to prove he belonged. He focused on effort he could control. Fitness. Discipline. Small goals. Matches that mattered only because he decided they did. The ranking told a brutal story. Outside the top 100, Agassi was forced into smaller tournaments. Empty stands. Early rounds. Long travel days without recognition. For a former world #1, this was humbling. But for the first time, it was honest. There was no illusion left to protect. Each win felt earned. Each loss felt instructional instead of condemning. Progress was slow, sometimes invisible. But it was real. The pressure that once suffocated him began to loosen. Tennis was no longer a verdict on his worth. It was just a task. One match at a time. Agassi changed how he listened to his body. He trained smarter. Recovered seriously. He surrounded himself with people who didn't need the image of a rebel or a superstar. He needed stability. Accountability. Structure chosen, not imposed. Emotionally, the hardest work happened away from the court. Accepting that his childhood had been shaped by control didn't mean blaming endlessly. It meant understanding patterns. Why authority triggered resistance. Why success felt empty. Why losing felt catastrophic. Awareness didn't erase the past, but it reduced its power. Slowly, confidence returned. Not the loud, performative confidence of his early career. A quieter version. One built on presence rather than approval. When he stepped onto the court now, he wasn't trying to escape anything. He was choosing to be there. Results followed, not immediately, but steadily. Victories stacked. Fitness improved. Belief solidified. The tennis world noticed the comeback, but few understood its depth. This wasn't a technical adjustment. It was a psychological rewrite decades in the making. When Agassi began winning big matches again, it felt different. The joy wasn't explosive. It was grounded. He wasn't chasing validation anymore. He was experiencing alignment. The game finally belonged to him. The turning point wasn't a single tournament or trophy. It was the moment he accepted responsibility without self-destruction. When he stopped seeing tennis as an enemy and started seeing it as a choice. That choice didn't erase the pain of the past. It reframed it. Agassi didn't become a different person overnight. But he became an honest one. And that honesty changed how he competed, how he trained, how he lived. The comeback that followed would shock the tennis world. But the real victory had already happened. He had reclaimed ownership of his life. And for the first time, that was enough. After the comeback, Andre Agassi's life began to settle into something unfamiliar. Stability. Not the fragile kind built on winning streaks, but the quieter kind that comes from knowing who you are when the match ends. Tennis was still part of his life, but it no longer defined his worth. His later career carried a different energy. He competed with clarity rather than urgency. Losses no longer shattered him. Wins no longer owned him. The hunger that once came from fear was replaced by purpose. When he finally stepped away from professional tennis, the exit wasn't an escape. It was a decision. Away from the tour, Agassi invested in building a life that hadn't existed for him as a child. Family mattered. Presence mattered. He learned how to stay still without feeling useless. How to be valued without performing. Those lessons didn't arrive easily. They came through repetition, patience, and humility, the same qualities he had once been denied the chance to develop. One of the most significant shifts was how he reframed success. For decades, achievement had been measured in rankings and trophies. Now, meaning came from impact. Agassi turned his attention toward education, particularly for children who grew up surrounded by instability and limited choice. He understood that environment shapes identity long before talent can speak. Through his foundation and schools, he focused on giving children something he never had. Safety. Support. The right to choose who they become. This wasn't charity driven by image. It was personal. He knew what happens when a child's value is reduced to performance. He had lived the consequences. Public perception changed over time. Agassi was no longer remembered only as the rebellious star of the 1990s or the fallen champion who disappeared from the rankings. He became a symbol of reinvention. Not the kind built on denial, but the kind built on honesty. His openness about addiction, mental health, and resentment toward tennis challenged the myth that champions must always love what they do. That honesty mattered. Especially in a world that celebrates success without asking about cost. Agassi's story gave permission to question narratives that equate achievement with fulfillment. It reminded athletes and non-athletes alike that discipline without choice can produce results, but it can also produce damage. Within tennis, his legacy became layered. Statistically, he stood among the greats. But culturally, he left something more difficult to measure. He normalized vulnerability in a sport that once treated it as weakness. He showed that returning from collapse doesn't require rewriting the past. It requires understanding it. Perhaps the most important aspect of Agassi's later life was what he no longer chased. Approval. Control. Validation through performance. The need to prove he belonged. Those battles had been fought and laid down. What remained was a man who had learned how to choose his path deliberately, even when it was uncomfortable. His story didn't end with a perfect resolution. There were still doubts. Still moments of reflection. Still reminders of the years lost to pressure and fear. But there was also peace. Not permanent. Not effortless. But real. In the end, Andre Agassi's greatest impact wasn't that he returned to the top of the sport. It was that he redefined what winning could mean. Not dominance. Not admiration. But alignment. He proved that it's possible to rebuild without pretending nothing broke. That success can be reclaimed without repeating the same damage. And that the hardest victories are often invisible to the crowd. Andre Agassi's journey isn't a lesson about talent or trophies. It's a lesson about ownership. About what happens when a life is built on expectation instead of choice. Success came early for him, but understanding came late. And that delay nearly cost him everything. His story shows that discipline without consent can produce results, but it can also produce resentment. That achievement without alignment can look impressive while quietly eroding the person underneath. Agassi didn't fail because he lacked ability. He collapsed because he had never been allowed to decide who he wanted to be. The most important shift in his life wasn't the comeback titles or the return to the top. It was the moment he stopped running from the truth. When he chose honesty over image, accountability over avoidance, presence over performance. That choice didn't erase the past. It changed how he carried it. Agassi reminds us that starting over doesn't always mean changing direction. Sometimes it means reclaiming the same path on your own terms. With clarity. With boundaries. With responsibility for both success and pain. Not everyone is forced into tennis. But many people are pushed into lives they didn't choose. Careers built to impress. Expectations inherited without consent. Success that looks right but feels wrong. Agassi didn't rewrite his story by becoming someone new. He rewrote it by finally becoming honest. And that leaves one quiet question behind. Not for champions. Not for athletes. For anyone who's ever felt trapped by a life that looks successful from the outside. So what's your story?